Okay, welcome to Ronald Sultana, who is joining us today on Mir's podcast, and we're going to interview him about career guidance. So Ronald, please tell our listeners a bit about yourself.
Hello, and thank you for having me. So yes, I've been, I lecture at the University of Malta, where I lecture on sociology and comparative education. And for the past several years, I've been doing quite a lot of research on behalf of the European Commission in Europe, but also in the Arab states, looking at the transition of young people, especially from school to work. And one mechanism to help young people find their place in life, find work, and be fulfilled at work is through what we refer to as career guidance, which is a set of activities that includes education about work, knowing how to look for work, knowing how to make sense of a very complex reality at work. And our task is to support that. So we develop policies, but also practical tools in order to support the transition to work of young people and young adults.
I understand that there are many perspectives on career guidance, and my impression, you can tell me if I'm wrong, is that you represent a more radical perspective. Because as our listeners, I don't know if you know, there's a conservative way of career guidance where people should just help people to find a job and choose very practically. You just see what jobs are out there, and then you help them apply. And then the second type is more liberal, where people you just encourage them to do whatever they like, and you try to help them to achieve their dreams. I used to work with high school dropouts in Norway. I still do when I go back. And some of them wants to be actors. And so I guess this liberal one would be like, okay, go for it. We'll help you become an actor. Mm-hmm. The third way is progressive, where you try to encourage them to push them to further what they thought they could, exceed the role that they know, and those around them, to be more than they imagined. And the fourth way is radical, where you encourage individuals to challenge the social and economic conditions that are constraining their choice. Do you think these four perspectives are connected to social class, and we have to choose our method of how we guide people according to how mature they are? Or can you just try to do the radical method to anyone?
If you think of what career guidance is about, which is offering, being in a supportive role in order to enable people find meaning in their life, find meaningful work in their lives. Now, of course, there is a dilemma here, which in a way you are implicitly referring to, which is the dilemma on the one side of actually finding work, and that it's important to find any work as long as you get some food on your table and on the table where your family is gathered. So there is this necessity of helping people just fit in at the end of the day, because you need to survive. And I'm not saying that that is not important. It would be foolish of me to say that is not important. It is extremely important, especially when we're talking about people who have very little choice in their lives, and that, finding work is going to bring food on the table. But having said that, I don't think we should stop there. I think besides helping people adapt to a situation in order to make a livelihood, I think as human beings, we should aspire for more. So whether you want to call it liberal or radical or whatever, what I'm committed to is being there for people and providing all kinds of support in order to help them achieve their potential. And to achieve one's potential, sometimes you need to challenge society, which is keeping you back. And it could be from the most basic, from the most simple, to the more radical and more political. I can be extremely political if, as I used to do when I was a careers advisor in schools, a young woman would come up and say, I would really like to become a mechanic, but I can't imagine myself as a woman becoming a mechanic. So there we start opening up, why do you think this way? What is there around you in society that is constraining your choices depending on your gender or depending on your social class, which is what you refer to, okay? Or depending on your ethnicity or whatever. So already a careers advisor who is doing his or her work well is already radical because we are intervening in the lives of human beings and saying something which is very simple but very radical. Why not? That question, why not, is extremely important because we keep receiving messages. You shouldn't do this, you can't do that. I remember when I did my PhD in New Zealand, I was observing careers advisors at work in a school where there were lots of indigenous people, what we call Polynesians or Maoris. And when the teacher was discussing with them what they would like to do as work, so that they have a goal, an objective, or a set of objectives, I remember that one Maori guy stood up and said jokingly, I will become a doctor. I want to become a doctor. When most Maoris at that time, not today, at that time, this was talking 30 years ago, were mainly becoming manual laborers. So he had integrated in himself the idea that to say that he would become a doctor was a joke. Yeah. He laughed at himself. And surprisingly, not only did the students laugh with him, but the careers advisor laughed as well, as if to say, of course, you'll never be a doctor. Now, our task is actually to challenge that. Not, as you suggested, the world is your oyster, in a liberal way. Rich people, privileged people will say that to their children. This is what I tell my kids. The world is your oyster. I'm going to help you in all sorts of ways, financially, giving you a great education, sending you abroad, and so on and so forth. This is us, the privileged. There are many people who are not as privileged. And we should not be in the business of simply saying, you reproduce the social class, you reproduce the ethnic groups, you reproduce the gender groups that you were born in. Our job is to intervene in people's lives, to open up possibilities, to show that even when we aspire, our aspirations are not simply personal aspirations. They are aspirations conditioned by what society tells us. So my job is to help others decode what's happening around us. And that word is important. That is, you interpret how power works in your life in order to keep some people at the top with all their privileges and some people lower down. And the more we understand how power works, hopefully, the more empowered we become. I suppose at first we might become very frustrated because when you see and you understand deeply how the dice are loaded against you, then there is anger, there is frustration, there is bitterness. But I think one can move beyond that in order to engage in political activity and educational activity, truly educational activity, to try to work against the grain, to fight against all that is limiting, constraining, and unfair and unjust. So what we are trying to do in our work at the moment with colleagues like Tristram Hooley from the UK, like Ria Thompson from Denmark, but there are many others, including people in Norway, where we are trying to develop a way of providing career services that are more enabling. more empowering. And that involves some pain, because it is painful to realize how society is organized in ways that keep people back and privilege other groups. So this is what we are trying to do. So if you want to call that radical, I would call it a different word. I would call it honest. It's an honest career guidance. Honest in the sense that it is aware of, acknowledges, and makes visible the dynamics of power in society.
And I think it's become very visible now during Corona, because you see, especially in Norway, the people who get sick are the people who clean, and the nurses and all these people. And
right.
You really see that the academics can just stay at home and work.
Absolutely. Let me talk about me. I am extremely privileged. My salary keeps coming in. I work. Perhaps I work even more than usual, because there is very little boundary between office time and home time. But I like my work so much that I don't mind. But I am safe. I can keep myself to myself. As far as I know, I don't get the virus by using, the laptop. But for the cleaner who comes to clean the apartment building, for the persons who deliver, they are more in danger. So, as you're saying very correctly, very wisely, the pandemic has functioned like a magnifying glass to show us the lines of privilege in a more dramatic way. Who falls ill, who is in danger, who has lost his job or her job, who has become insecure, who is considered to be important and therefore given top medical attention, and who is considered to be less important and ignored. All this is coming to the surface. And in sociology, this is called critical incident. When you have a critical incident, like the pandemic, but it could be anything, like an economic collapse, or even a physical problem like an earthquake. The critical incident tends to bring to the surface things that are already there but hidden, but it brings them to the surface. And what we realize, I've just been reading, for example, how COVID-19 has been particularly harmful to women, for example, in all sorts of ways. How the women have had to bear the brunt, the responsibilities at home more than men, although some men have been good and actually did help, but also in terms of additional stress, including domestic violence, for example. Right. So what we're saying here is a very simple yet powerful sociological fact, which is that power is everywhere in society, and that there are winners and losers, and that there tends to be patterns. And it would be terrible if something like career guidance, or education for that matter, function in such a way that they reproduce and reinforce inequalities and injustices, rather than name them and challenge them in all sorts of ways. So what we're trying to do in the way we are articulating career guidance services is certainly to challenge, to acknowledge, to name injustice. Just to mention one example, a very good friend of mine, who is, one of the main leaders in our field, who has retired recently, Tony Watts, from the UK. He has been to Norway several times. And Tony Watts was telling us about his experience in South Africa, and how devastated he was during the time of apartheid, when he found that career guidance was being used to encourage Black people and colored people to aim for manual jobs, low-skill jobs, low-pay jobs, while white people were being encouraged to aim high and to go for professions and high-pay jobs. That is a clear example where career guidance is working hand in hand with power.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, because there have been some incidents in Norway where some young people have been writing articles in the paper, and they tested them. When I was in high school, the teacher told me, or the career guidance person told me not to become a doctor, but become a nurse instead, and things like that. So it's not very easy. But then sometimes I've been working in school and I ask them, do you do that? And they say, I try not to, but it's hard because sometimes I look at their grades and I see that they don't have the grades enough to become a doctor. And so I just try to make it like a reality check for them.
Right.
But it's really hard to know where the truth is.
Yes, that what you're saying is very true. And in no way should we kind of criticize blindly people who are at the chalk face working with young people, and you get somebody who has not invested in his education, or her education has not good grades, and simply expects to become, you know, a doctor. But there are ways and ways. And I think one of the things we have learned is that very often, without realizing perhaps, what we consider to be realistic is really a reflection of our prejudice. We have to be extremely careful. I know I used to be a counselor in a school only for girls. There were only female students. And I remember how hurt some of the young women were, because what their parents, not just their teachers, what their parents thought was realistic was, well, you eventually get married and the financial responsibility for the family will mainly be in the hands of your husband. And in Malta, which was quite a traditional society when I was young, I remember how hurt these girls were, how also, for example, when they were in a dating relationship with a young man, the young man would be upset if his girlfriend was doing very well at school. It threatened his masculinity. So there are all these things that come into play. That's why it's very important when you are a careers advisor to have learned a lot about not only economics and labor markets, but also psychology, sociology, philosophy. It's a difficult job to be able to understand how we develop our sense of who we are, and how that sense of who we are and our aspirations are limited by the kinds of subtle and not so subtle messages that we receive. And one of that messages, it's not realistic for you to aim. And I like to tell people the story of my life when at school, at the age of 13, I failed 5 subjects. And the teachers told my father, this boy is not cut out for school. I think you should remove him from this school and put him in a trade school where he will learn a skill, a vocational skill. I might have been very happy, but I became a PhD scholar and, you know, university professor. They were wrong about me.
So what happened? Why did you fail?
That's an interesting story. Again, something to learn from that. I come from a relatively modest background where we speak in our language, which is Maltese, which is a mix between Arabic and Italian. Elite families speak in English at home.
Okay.
Because I did very well in my exams, I went to an English-speaking school. And for the first 2 years, I was lost. Because I did not have what Bourdieu calls the cultural capital to follow lessons and to remain focused. My mind would wander. You know, when you're listening to a foreign language all the time, your attention span becomes very low. After 10 minutes, 15 minutes, your brain wanders. So I started doing very badly. Until I became, you know, proficient in English and I could follow. So that story from my own personal life makes me cautious. And I tell the people I train, I want to make them feel bad, cautious, really be careful before you. Who are you to decide what the potential of another person is? Who are you? I have seen kids, I mean, you work with school dropouts or those who the school drops out, because the way we use language is very important. There are these kids who the school rejects, and they reject schooling. It's a question of both of them pushing and pulling each other away. I've seen kids like that who at school do not perform well. But then they join a youth club. I was in a youth club when I was 15 years old. I was in charge of young people already at the age of 15. And these kids who were escaping from school because they couldn't stand it were creating songs, musicals, writing plays, being leaders in another context, in the context of the youth club. At school, they were considered to be quite useless. But in the youth club, where their relationship to their teachers was on a friendly basis, we used to play football together, they blossomed, they flourished. So they had potential. And it's terrible, it's absolutely terrible when we make the horrendous mistake of saying that that person doesn't have potential. It is bad from the economic point of view, but it's also, for me, even worse from the human point of view.
Yeah, and it's interesting, your example, because you didn't know English very well, and that's why you didn't do very well at school. And it's like that for many of the refugees who come now.
Exactly, well done, very good. Yes.
So it's, but you also had this kind of drive, I guess, to do this, and I think they also do. So how can we, as counselors, become the best? How can we enable them in the best possible way? Them
being the refugees or anybody really? Who are you referring to?
Refugees.
Okay, yeah. Right. Well, at the moment, I'm working with two people actually at the moment. One of them is Andreas Fejes from Sweden, Jönköping University, and the other one is from Laval University in Quebec, Manon Chamberlain. And we're together editing a volume where we're trying to capture some best practice of how careers advisors work with refugees. And it's not simple. It's not simple. And there are a number of factors that we're coming across that I could perhaps refer to. I think the first hugely important one is ourselves. I think the biggest resource that a careers advisor has is not his or her technical competence first. I think first is his or her personal qualities. Are we truly multicultural? Are we truly open to diversity? Are we truly welcoming and hospitable? It's a very important word, hospitalité, which is a word that is used by philosophers like Levinas, like Derrida. Very important words. Are we truly hospitable of the other? There is a phrase which Levinas uses, which has always moved me greatly. He says, when I am in front of the face of the other, I tremble in awe. And I think the first thing that we have to do as careers advisors, as teachers, as social workers, is to tremble in awe in front of the face of the other, to realize the beauty, the dignity of the other. If we have that stance, if we have that attitude towards the other, then I think many other things follow. But we have to start from that. Then, of course, it follows that we mobilize as many skills, competencies as we can in order to support their integration without losing their identity. which is a major challenge. And I'm not saying that we have answers, ready-made answers. I've tried to write about this. I'm thinking a lot about this. I'm also involved with NGOs working on this line. And at the moment, I can still say that I'm really trying to understand and learn. But certainly, what I've noticed is that, number one, as you're saying so well, language is crucial for integration. It's absolutely vital that refugees have the means of being recognized by the other through language. Language is absolutely crucial. But then there are other things that one can do. For example, practical things. A lot of the refugees that we encounter have escaped war, have escaped conflict, have escaped perhaps drought, have escaped regimes, and they do not carry with them the certification of the results of their study. So a very simple thing is developing through careers advice what we call recognition of prior learning or recognition of prior experiential learning, okay? Which means that we create a parallel system to the formal one, which is schooling and credentials, so that we recognize and reward and use and pay the skills that people come with. So that's one very practical thing, which we're doing here in our faculty. I'm part of the committee here where we have a number of migrants and refugees who we are encouraging to become teachers. They don't have the qualifications that we usually recognize, but they have so many other qualifications that can become evident and transparent if we use these tools of what we call RPL, recognition of prior learning. That's one very basic. But this very basic thing is extremely enabling. I mean, I had one person who was from one of the Eastern Bloc countries, highly qualified, working as a cleaner, very frustrated. She has so much to offer. We need teachers, and we can't employ her because she doesn't have the formal qualifications. So careers advice, besides all the, stuff that we usually do in schools, has it to develop new approaches in order to work with refugees in a sensitive and empowering way, which could include political work. That is advocacy. That is, for example, one of the NGOs I had some connections with in Malta, which is the Jesuit Refugee Service. They have actually employed a lawyer who works with refugees, and the refugees tell the lawyer when they are being exploited. In Malta, there was a period where these were really being exploited right, left, and center. They were being, picked up from a place you might have heard of, Marsa. They're picked up in the morning, taken to work, and then either given very little money, and because they were working without a permit, they would not have the possibility of going to accuse their employer that they were being exploited. So the Jesuit Refugee Service provided a lawyer where the lawyer would write to the employer and saying, look, you are exploiting this person. This is against the law. It's against human decency. We ask you to stop. If you don't stop, we will take legal action. That's advocacy. This is something, so we cannot say, oh, I'm just a careers advisor. The kinds of models that we are promoting say that we have political responsibility. We don't only have technical responsibility, technocratic responsibility. We also have what we're calling emancipatory guidance, a guidance that emancipates, that helps young people and older people, whoever, to really flourish and live decent human lives. Because we believe that that is everybody's right. And that we also strongly believe, and we've written books about this, that the way the world is organized with an economic system which we call neoliberal, a neoliberal capitalist system, might have done a lot of good in some ways. I mean, we mustn't, forget that the huge advances that have been made over the last 250 years. But at the same time, it's created a system which is terribly destructive, not only of the environment, but also destructive of human beings, where profit is what matters, and the notion of human dignity and the notion of social contract between the state and the individual and the community has been either damaged, clouded over, or even forgotten. And what we have learned from the pandemic is that the state has an enormous responsibility in order to protect and give security, a sense of security to its, I was going to say its citizens, even more than citizens, to its residents, to people within its fold. Okay? Because the word citizens is very beautiful, but it's also exclusive. It does not include the refugees. It does not include asylum seekers unless they are made citizens. So citizenship is a very enabling and empowering discourse, but what we're saying is we have to go beyond that and embrace humanity. And, what we have been doing is exactly the opposite. The gap between the haves and the have-nots has increased enormously. We have very important studies that show, the increase of poverty and extreme poverty, the big gaps between the global north and the global south. So what we're trying to do is to weave a discourse, to weave an approach towards career guidance and to education more generally that is aware of these issues that are of planetary and global concern.
Yeah, I think it's really important. But sometimes when I also am the director of a board of my organization, MIR, Multikulturelt Initiativ og Ressursnettverk. And we work a lot with immigrants and refugees and a lot of women, and some of them are really angry when they come to us. Not at us, but they're angry at the society because they say, oh, we try to find jobs and nobody wants to employ us. And they have this system in Norway where you get to to get work experience, you work for free in a way. I mean, you get money from the Social Security, but you go to this store or whatever, and then you do the work, and then you don't get that much. But it's like for work experience and to learn Norwegian. But then some of them exploit these people. So they get sent to this place, and then after 6 months, they get sent to another place. And all this anger that I really want to help them, but it's not very easy. So what do you think is the best way? I don't know if there's an easy answer or any answer at all, but how can we help these people? And it's not only women, also men who are in this situation. And as you said earlier, men are maybe, they feel if they can't support their family anymore, also there's the loss of status and things like that. So it's very complicated.
Well, as you said, I mean, this is not something that one can give the answer to, but I think that there are ways of exploring, reactions to these kinds of injustices. And one very powerful way, and I've seen this happening in a number of countries, including my own, where as part of a social movement, of a group, which could be an NGO or a group of NGOs, one makes sure that certain issues are on the political agenda, so that new laws are passed which are more fair. There we are depending on the state being upright, the state really playing the part of having what is called a social contract with its citizens, where it has a responsibility to ensure that it uses its power and its presence institutionally in a country to make sure that the right laws are passed, that the right employment contracts are issued, that what is clearly and unequivocally unjust, unfair, exploitative stops happening. Norway is a very good example of a country that has done this in relation, for example, to the rights of persons with disability. I was born in a country where those who were disabled were often hidden from view. Nowadays, they are mainstreamed in classrooms, in schools. There are incentives to take persons with disability at work so that they feel integrated. And that's beautiful. I mean, this is in the lifetime of one generation. So we can develop strategies, and history is there for the making. Often, as Marx would have said, under conditions that we have not much control over, but we can make a difference. History is there for us to write. Usually it's for the powerful people to write history. It's the winners who write history. And I think for the last, certainly 40 years, from the 70s onwards, history has tended to be written by those who are in charge of industry, who we normally call the capitalist class, and we have given them so much more power that the Scandinavian experiment of trying to find a balance between the captains of industry, as they were called, and the rights of citizens, there was some kind of balance with, the social model, social welfare, that kind of social contract where, you can make profit, but we socialize as much of the profit as possible. We distribute the wealth that you create. That Scandinavian model, which has so much going for it, is now, being questioned. But we are seeing in many parts of the world that the alternative to that, because it does have its own problems, of course, but the alternative to that is the creation of a class of poverty, steeped in poverty, increasing stress, increasing insecurity, precarity. We talk about the austerity and precarity for the rest of us, while the very wealthy ones are obscenely rich, obscene. So there's something wrong. It's so evident that there's something wrong, but we have created a situation where this starts becoming normal, has started looking normal. So what our task is to problematize that, to say, as the story that we used to be told when we were young, that the emperor has no clothes. He goes around the street thinking that he's great. Everybody doesn't dare say anything. But a child tells him, the emperor has no clothes on. And that's what we have to do, really show, and we have the evidence now. We have so much evidence that, the free market system, this neoliberal craze for profits at all costs is bankrupt. It's very dangerous. And we cannot be teachers, we cannot be social workers, we cannot be careers advisors, we cannot be really anything to do with the social institutions of society that we inhabit without having a deep appreciation of how power works. So that's the main kind of idea that comes through from the work we do.
Yeah, that's very important. So we have to work together, all the NGOs and...
Oh, yes, absolutely. That's where your power will come from.
And before we end this interesting conversation, I think we could have gone on and much longer, but I think we have to. But I heard you cite Socrates in one of your lectures, where you said that if the work of a counselor to be midwife of someone's soul.
Yes, I love that.
How will you do that in real life?
To be the midwife. I think what probably Socrates meant, and there's so much wisdom there, it is a humbling approach to the work we do with others. we are not their saviors. We are not there to do things for them, but there is a belief and a trust in the other person as having the capacities to flourish. Our task is to make that flourishing happen, to remove the conditions that stop it from happening. A bit like in Plato's cave, you know, where you only see shadows unless you go out in the light. So our task is to be the soil in which the plant grows. The plant will grow. It will just need the soil, the nourishment that we give it. And we are there to make the soul become born, so to speak. It's there already. So that means that we approach individuals and communities with a lot of respect and a lot of humility, which we do not often speak about in our professional language when we talk about how people should interact with each other. This is something I learned a lot from Paulo Freire, who is a very important Brazilian pedagogist. I mean, he's got brilliant books like Pedagogy of the Oppressed, for example. It's a classic. Very deeply philosophic, but then he uses words like you have to have love, respect, humility, you know, very simple words, which are very profound. And I think it is that kind of humanistic, but humanistic with a punch to it. Because sometimes I'm afraid that in counseling and in career guidance, there are some very humanistic people wanting to do good, but they do not engage also in a critique of power. So what critical pedagogy or emancipatory guidance, if you want to call it that way, what these approaches do, there's even critical psychology developed by Barreau, for example, a very famous Jesuit psychologist from Latin America who was murdered. I mean, there is this approach of being humanistic, so kind, gentle, loving, etc., but at the same time having an understanding of how power works. You have to bring them together. In some ways, it's bringing together psychology and sociology with an underpinning of philosophy that gives you a sense of who we are in the world. Socrates was very powerful. He was so powerful, he was told to commit suicide.
Yes.
And I think you're a good careers advisor if people from the top who have power start getting upset by what you are doing. If they praise you too much, it means that you are, you know, singing their tune. So that's another signal that you are, you know, you have been co-opted.
Yeah.
And it's very easy to be co-opted. Very, very easy. Because we are privileged. We are part of the gang, so to speak. So to cross the line and go on the side of the, you know, the down and out, the people who you said, you know, are out of school, who cannot flourish, who are frustrated. And it requires courage. And I'm not saying that I'm doing that, but at least I'm saying I should do that. At least it's already a start.
Good. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your questions. Yeah, very provocative questions. Thank you.